Like our other organs, the brain has evolved, increasing over millions of years in complexity and information content. Its structure reflects all the stages through which it has passed. The brain has evolved from the inside out. Deep inside is the oldest part, the so-called brain stem. It conducts many of the basic biological functions, including the rhythms of life, like heartbeat and respiration. The higher functions of the brain have evolved in 3 successive stages, according to a provocative insight by the American biologist Paul MacLean. You see, capping the brain stem is the so-called R complex, R for reptile. It's the seat of aggression, ritual, territoriality, and social hierarchies. It evolved some hundreds of millions of years ago in our reptilian ancestors. So deep inside our brain is something rather like the brain of a crocodile. Surrounding the R complex is the limbic system, or mammal brain. It evolved some tens of millions of years ago in ancestors who were mammals, all right, but not yet primates like monkeys or apes. It's a major source of our moods and emotions, our concern and care for the young. And then finally, on the outside of the brain, living in a kind of uneasy truce with the more primitive brains beneath, is the cerebral cortex, evolved millions of years ago in ancestors who were primates. This is the point of embarkation for all our cosmic journeys, the cerebral cortex, where matter is transformed into consciousness. Here, comprising more than 2/3 of the brain mass, is the realm both of intuition and of critical analysis. It's here that we have ideas and inspirations, here that we read and write, here that we do mathematics and music. The cortex regulates our conscious lives. It is the distinction of our species, the seat of our humanity. Art and science live here. Civilization is a product of the cerebral cortex. Behind the forehead are the frontal lobes of the cerebral cortex. They may be the places where we anticipate events, where we figure out the future. But if we can foresee an unpleasant future, we can take steps to avoid it. Down here in the frontal lobes may be the means of ensuring human survival, if we have the wisdom to pay attention. Inside the cerebral cortex is the microscopic structure of thought. The language of the brain is not the DNA language of the genes. What we know is encoded in cells called neurons, tiny switching elements, every connection representing 1 bit of information. How many neurons do each of us have? Maybe 100 billion, comparable to the number of stars in the Milky Way galaxy. And there are something like 100 trillion neural connections. This intricate and marvelous network of neurons has been called an enchanted loom, where millions of flashing shuttles weave a dissolving pattern. Even in sleep, the brain is pulsing and throbbing and flashing with the complex business of human life, dreaming, remembering, figuring things out. Our thoughts, our visions, our fantasies have a tangible, physical reality. What does a thought look like? Well, it's made of hundreds of electrochemical impulses. Over there, for example, is a spark of a memory, maybe the smell of lilacs on a country road in childhood. And there goes a bit of an anxious all-points bulletin. Perhaps, where did I leave my keys? The neurons store sounds, too, and snatches of music. Whole orchestras play inside our heads. The landscape of the human cerebral cortex is deeply furrowed
And there's a good reason for it. These convolutions greatly increase the surface area available for information storage in a skull of limited size. The world of thought is roughly divided into two hemispheres. Over there is the right hemisphere of the cerebral cortex. It's mainly responsible for pattern recognition, intuition, sensitivity, creative insights. And over here is the left hemisphere, presiding over rational, analytic, and critical thinking.
These are the two sides, the dual strengths, the essential opposites that characterize human thinking. Before us are the means, both for generating ideas and for testing their validity. There's a continuous dialogue going on between the two hemispheres of the brain, channeled through this immense bundle of nerve fibers, which is called the corpus callosum. It's a bridge between creativity and analysis, both of which are necessary if we're to understand the world.
The information content of the human brain, expressed in bits, is probably comparable to the number of connections between the neurons in the cortex. About 100 trillion bits, 10 to the 14th connections. If written out in English, it would fill some 20 million volumes, as many as in the world's largest libraries. The equivalent of 20 million volumes worth of information is inside the heads of every one of us. The brain is a very big place in a very small space.
Most of the books in the brain are up here in the cerebral cortex. Down there, in the basement of the brain, are the functions that our remote ancestors mainly depended on for survival. Aggression, child rearing, sex, the willingness to follow leaders blindly, lots of things that we can still recognize in our lives today. Of the higher brain functions, some of them, like reading, writing, speaking, seem to be located in particular places in the cerebral cortex. On the other hand, each memory seems to be stored in many separate locales in the brain. Old memories are in lots of places. But the brain does much more than just recollect. It intercompares, it synthesizes, it analyzes, it generates abstractions.
The simplest thought, like the concept of the number 1, has an elaborate logical underpinning. The brain has its own language for testing the structure and consistency of the world, but we never see the machinery of logical analysis, only the conclusions.
There's so much more that we must figure out than the genes can know. That's why the brain library has 10,000 times more information in it than the gene library. Our passion for learning is the tool for our survival.
And unlike the musty bindings of our gene library, in which hardly a word changes in a century, the brain library is made of loose-leaf books. We're constantly adding new pages and new volumes.
Emotions and ritual behavior patterns are built very deeply into us. They're part of our humanity, but they're not characteristically human. Many other animals have feelings. What distinguishes our species is thought. The cerebral cortex is, in a way, a liberation. We need no longer be trapped in the genetically inherited behavior patterns of lizards and baboons, territoriality and aggression and dominance hierarchies. We are, each of us, largely responsible for what gets put into our brains, for what, as adults, we wind up caring for and knowing about. No longer at the mercy of the reptile brain, we can change ourselves. Think of the possibilities.